And welcome to our Center for Mission YouTube page. It's great to have you all back here today. As you may know, our Center for Mission is building an Archdiocesan Care for Creation team, and that has been under the works for the last 18 months. And part of our work is looking at issues of divestment, reinvestment, and sustainable land usage. And we have a unique opportunity to talk with a Catholic who has been involved in a successful divestment campaign. Emily Burke, I'm going to give you an opportunity now to introduce yourself, and then we will have our conversation.
Yeah, hi. So I'm Emily Burke. I'm from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I just graduated from Creighton University in Omaha, Nebraska. This coming fall, I'm going to be a first-year doctoral student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the joint Sociology and Community and Environmental Sociology program. And yeah, I was involved in some divestment work at Creighton.
That's a really interesting degree program you got there. So
Yes.
joint sociology and community engagement program. So tell us a little bit about what you want to study in that program.
Yeah, so I'm really into environmental sociology, looking at sort of the ways that we're dealing with environment, the ways that humans relate to our environment, especially given our American context in the midst of a climate crisis. So yeah, that's kind of my jam.
All right, wonderful. So I'm super excited to have you aboard and get this conversation scheduled. We've done some work together as a disclaimer
Mhm.
for the Laudato Si in the U.S. Catholic Church conference. Emily was my supervisor in that program as on the track I was on. So I give that as disclaimer in the midst of doing this interview, is that we do have a professional connection that exists outside of just this specific interview. But in that case, I think she's also brought a great unique perspective on divestment for those of us that are trying to start the work of this or imagine what it could look like in our own archdiocese, and for the listeners across the country, if you're looking to start this in somewhere other than the Archdiocese of St. Paul, Minneapolis, which is where the Center for Mission is located, this can give you some great ideas as well. All right, so Emily, let's go with the basics and start. So, what is a divestment campaign for those of us that might be just trying to learn what this is?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think that's unclear for a lot of people, and that's why conversations about it become so difficult. So, on just a very basic level, divestment is the opposite of investment. So, it's pulling investments, pulling whether that be stocks, bonds, other investments out of companies or industries that are seen as immoral or unethical or unaligned with an institution's mission. Um, in this case, we're talking about fossil fuel divestment. So, pulling investments out of the fossil fuel industry because we know the damage that the fossil fuel industry is doing. They're sort of driving this climate crisis. And so, it's by pulling those investments out, it's making a statement that, as individuals, as institutions, we're not okay with that. We don't agree with that. And it's sort of like a boycott act in a way.
All right. So, how did you get the idea to pursue this campaign on the Creighton campus, and kind of give us a little bit of your background for your story for how you became involved?
Yeah. Yeah. So when I was a sophomore, so almost 3 years ago, which is kind of weird, um, I was in a theology of climate change class. It was a small class with like me and I think like 12 other students. And we were, going through the climate science and aligning that with the Catholic mission and, sort of sussing out like what do we do as individuals, what do we do as Catholics. And Creighton is a Catholic Jesuit college. So we talked a lot about, mission in that class and what Creighton stood for and things like that. Um, and after that class, it was just me and a few other students. We were sort of like left with this like feeling of like, what do we do? Like, what can we possibly do? When you look at the climate science, it's easy to become sort of panicked inside. And I remember a lot of just like laying awake at night thinking like, oh my God, why did I not know about this until now? And like, why are we not talking about this? Why is there not more being done about this? And so it was after that class that me and a few other students began a sort of conversation like, what can we do? Like, what is out there that we could do? Um, and so after a little research, looking at like university level things, student level things, we looked into the idea of divestment. We were ourselves learning about it. We had not heard of it. And there were some other schools at the time, not as many as there are now, but particularly like Harvard, who students were sort of pushing for this. So we were like, maybe this is something that we could do. So as a lowly sophomore, I attended some meetings with some important provosts and financial people at Creighton. And basically it was me and two other students, and they were like, what, like, it's great that you care about this, but there's 3 students sitting in our office, and to pursue something this large and this consequential, we need to know that more than 3 students care. So we were sort of sent back. We hit a couple roadblocks, and we decided that if this was going to be something that we wanted to push for, it would be something that we would have to push for with a much bigger front. So we spent some time organizing and mobilizing other students and educating other students as we were still educating ourselves. It's a complex matter. But yeah, we organized some protests. We did marches across campus. We wrote letters to the president, to the board of trustees, things like that. And we really got the conversation going on our campus.
So there's a key education component before you begin the actual work of divestment, is just trying to do a mass conversation and educational outreach piece.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think we would have accomplished what we did, especially in the time frame that we did. I mean, Creighton divested within about 2 years of when we started. So I don't think that would have happened had we not focused our first initial pushes on education, on educating even, other students, but even faculty, administration, things like that. Because, there are schools who have had active divestment campaigns for 6-7 years, and they haven't seen the same sort of response. So I think a key to our quick turnaround was our focus on education. Absolutely.
And and so you had mentioned that you had done some petitions, you'd done some protests. How did you go about getting signatures and getting other people interested? Because I'm sure it had to take more than the 3 people that you had started the campaign with to actually get this to be a full-scale success.
Yeah. Part of that was the education, just being willing to talk to people, to put on events for other students or whoever to attend, things like that. But I think a key reason that people started listening to us, that people started coming to the events that we were holding, and people started signing things that we were asking them to, was the appeal to Creighton's mission. Students choose to go to a school like Creighton that has a Catholic Jesuit mission for a reason. It's more expensive. It's a private college. People who attend Creighton are more likely than not attracted to the mission, the fact that they are standing for, the promotion of justice and, the uplifting of the marginalized and things like that. So when we connected the issue of climate change, and particularly divestment and, going after the fossil fuel industry, we connected that with Creighton's mission. And we were saying, look, Creighton is saying all these things. Creighton is saying that we care for creation, we care for the poor and vulnerable, but then look what we're doing. There's money invested in fossil fuels. And so I think making that connection for people was really instrumental in garnering the sort of support that we did. So I think when we connected it to what people knew to be their values and the values of the institution to which they belonged, that's when it sort of clicked.
Yeah. And that's a good, when you have an intentional community like a college campus community that's invested in mission, I think it's a very good way to connect for these are our values.
Mm-hmm.
So then tell me a little bit about resistance. So, because I'm sure this wasn't an easy road to get to a place where you influenced a university to fully divest from fossil fuels. So tell me a little bit about how resistance played a part in doing your climate work.
Yeah, it was huge. Even so, first and foremost, Creighton is a private college, so they really have no obligation to report any of their financial data, anything to the public. And so the first sort of resistance that we hit was we had no data. We couldn't even prove at first that Creighton was invested in fossil fuels. And, you know, asking that question is not like, it's not just an easy like softball question. It's like we were trying to get like data that had, you know, huge implications. And so to even bring that up and to bring this conversation up, we got a lot of eye rolls. We got a lot of, you know, head shakes from administration, from people who like had access to this information. And even once we did get the data, once we did start rolling, once we started writing petitions and things like that, there were people, students, faculty, administration, who just on a very ideological level disagreed with it, thought that, you know, we should not be first talking about it as students, like that's not our area of expertise, so we shouldn't really have a say in it, kind of thing. Some people who believed that it was the market's job to, you know, let this play out, and if the market is valuing fossil fuels, then they must be valuable, things like that. So, you know, one way that I learned to deal with it personally, I don't love conflict. I'm an introvert. I don't really want to touch that with a 10-foot pole, but something that I learned and I sort of grew in as an individual was willingness to have hard conversations, willingness to put differences aside and, you know, talk about an issue for what it is, and, you know, try to put ideological lenses off for a minute. But other than that, there was just times where I had to choose between, you know, staying quiet and, you know, maybe staying a little on the safer side, or continuing on this work, or responding to that email, or, you know, talking at this event that may risk some uncomfortability, some confrontation in the future. But yeah.
Great. And so you had various pieces of the institution that are resisting the work. You're finding your supporters. What was the piece that kind of eventually like started to tip it over the iceberg to where it looked like you were actually going to get a divestment campaign successfully polished?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we had held several demonstrations. We were really appealing to the university president. That was sort of where we were addressing our messages, you know, pointing our energies.
Yep.
And we wrote student legislation. It passed throughout the student body. The whole campus voted on it, passed with flying colors. Basically, that just went to the desk of the president. And he came back a few days later and put out a statement that he was rejecting our proposal. You know, he said Creighton will not be divesting at this time. It didn't align with their investment strategy as having a properly diversified endowment, things like that. And so we were like, okay, so this is like a loss, I guess you could say. Like, where do we go from here? Where do we turn? And so looking at the power structure of Creighton, the power structure of a university, we sort of realized that, you know, we're directing all our energy towards the university president, but he's at sort of the mercy, I guess you would say, as far as power goes, to the board of trustees. Mm-hmm. And so we started directing our energies towards the board of trustees. And, you know, there were some, and still are some, board members at Creighton who have ties to the fossil fuel industries, whether that's directly or indirectly, or who just ideologically did not agree with divestment as a tactic, or a strategy to address climate change.
Yep.
So when we sort of changed our path and sort of directed our energy towards the board of trustees, we held an event where we marched from one end of the campus to the other, where the boardroom was, where the board of trustees have their meetings. It was the day of a meeting on the Phoenix campus, so they weren't there physically, but they were meeting. And as we marched across campus, we read the names of all of the board of trustees, and after each name, we said a prayer from Laudato Si, and particularly a verse or a line that said, "We hope that this person realizes their power and money, that they avoid the sin of indifference, advance the common good," things like that. And I think that sort of personal call out was a huge tipping point. We had heard afterwards, after the event, we had like almost 200 students marching and saying these names and saying these prayers. We were praying for them, so you can't really be upset.
Yeah.
And so we had heard afterwards that not only got the attention of the board of trustees, but that sort of upset them. They felt called out in a way that they didn't appreciate. And I think looking back in retrospect, that's where things really started happening. And as uncomfortable as it must have been to be a board of trustees hearing students pray for you and call out your name in that way, I think that was a sort of wake-up call in a way, that they were like, maybe we should start listening to this. Maybe this is worth our attention. But yeah, that was a key shift.
Well, and I mean, having 200 students march and act unified in prayer, that's a pretty significant percentage of Creighton's population, especially of the undergrad side.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's 4,000 undergrads. It's not a huge school. There's 8,000 students total, 4,000 undergrads. To have a turnout to any event of 200, 300, 400, it was sort of crazy. So
yeah.
All
right. So then you had talked a little bit about having to respond to the email and having to ask hard questions. So tell me a little bit more about what is the guiding, and we've talked a little bit about prophetic witness and prophetic questions and how that is connected to the Old Testament tradition. So tell me a little bit about like how climate change and your understanding of scripture leads to a prophetic questioning of how we're responding to climate change.
Yeah, that's a good question. So at a really basic level, I understand prophetic witness to be, realizing what ought to be and looking at what is and wanting to bring those together. So, I mean, going off of my own Catholic values, my experience at a Jesuit college and embrace of the Jesuit values, I see the promotion of justice, the lifting up of the poor and vulnerable, and I see what climate change is doing, and it's just the opposite. It's most immediately and most severely affecting those who have done the least to contribute to it, those who are poorest already, and so it's seeing what ought to be, and seeing what is, and so divestment is one way of addressing that. It's not the only way, it's not the solution, but that's where I saw as a student at Creighton that I had power to do something. And so that was my way of doing that. But I think looking at the problems in our society and looking at what ought to be based on our faith, that's where it becomes worth it to ask those hard questions. That's where it becomes worth it to send that potentially controversial email, things like that.
Okay. So then talk a little bit more about how you get to the process of asking a prophetic question, but then the strategy behind and who you actually make the request of, because I think that's a really interesting piece here in the Creighton, is that you had started, you're going to try to engage the president. The president's like, oh, I'm not going to approve this. And then so you had to think about how do you connecting to the board of trustees. So like, how do you find the right people and the right right like spot, which is likely to get at least a listening ear. You're not even necessarily looking for change. You're just looking for a listening ear to express your concerns. So how do you do that effectively in the midst of a multi-layered institution?
Yeah, that's a good question. And that's, so in undergrad and now going into my PhD program, I'm a sociologist. So looking at systems and structures and hierarchies and things like that is something that I'm comfortable with and I've done a lot, but not everybody has. And so one tool that I think is really helpful when you're looking at even where to find a listening ear, but when you're trying to identify where is the power, where are the decision makers, things like that, is power mapping. And so this is an activity that we have talked about, Adam, but when you're looking at, so an institution, in my case, a university, you have, administration, you have even below administration, you have staff who's the sort of gatekeepers or like the people who have access to administration. You have the president, in my case, the board of trustees. And so when you look at who has connections to who has, power over who's technically above who, and then where commonalities are, where, certain power players are that has access to several different layers of the institution, that's when you sort of start to realize where to turn or where to go to first, where to start. And so, yeah, by mapping out, and we did this as students, we did it on a whiteboard. We were sitting in a room and we started making circles and lines and connecting the pieces of Creighton and sort of deciding where is the most strategic place to start, who has the most power, who are we ultimately aiming to appeal to change their mind, things like that. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
Nice. And we had talked about power mapping, as you had said, and it's not always the person that you think it is when you start doing the research, right? Like, I mean, it's very easy to start a campaign thinking you're going to be trying to change the mind of one particular person, then find yourself having to adjust. So what did you learn about how power structures operate, even in the midst of a hierarchical institution such as a university? Like, how did you learn kind of about those soft power players, and what can you tell us about soft power and how that plays into how you make decisions about who to engage in terms of a community organizing campaign?
Yeah, in terms of community organizing, one of the main things that I learned was just that it's helpful to have allies, whether they are like explicit allies who make it known to everyone that they support that, or sort of behind closed doors allies who are willing to tell you what they know, maybe feed some information to people, things like that. It's helpful to just have conversations with people. It's helpful to have allies on all layers of the power map. And another thing is just the power of, bottom up organizing. I didn't know that it would be so key to have so many students sort of buy into what we were trying to do until we started, getting laughed at in people's offices saying, there's 3 of you here, why would I do anything? So I think the importance of, as far as hierarchies go, and as far as, university structure goes, or other institutions like that, even, parishes, to have so many parishioners at the quote unquote bottom of the hierarchy be talking about something, be organizing for something, having this sort of agreement that there's a way of proceeding, that there's an end goal that ultimately is just and right and aligns with the institution of the mission. That's powerful. And so, I mean, in terms of a university, having students all show up for things, sign things, talk to people about things. In terms of a parish, having parishioners being willing to talk to their priest, talk to their bishop, have, events where this issue, in my case, divestment, but is discussed. I think it's worth something. It's not every day that parishioners all, gather around one issue. And I think that would make it a clear statement.
Yeah. And so there's a lot of creativity that has to be involved, especially if you're advocating for something that is in line with Catholic moral and social teaching and in line with your local mission at your particular university, but not necessarily in the popular purview. So how do you, and we talked a little bit about how you kind of overcame some of the pieces, but how do you, in terms of other people that might be interested in starting a divestment campaign, like how do you get the right set of skills in the room to actually like make a contribution has a chance of sticking? Because you're not going to necessarily get a win, but how are you going to get the right team together to give you the best chance to do so?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I'd like to say that we just got lucky, but I think it was just we had a core group of students who was willing to put in the work, to be reliable, to give their time, to give their energies. We had someone who was really good at like the financial side of things. He was a business major. He, knew the economics of divestment. And then there was people like me who were, more social science focused and, could look at hierarchies and could do power mapping and things like that. We had people who social media was their jam. So they were, running our accounts and making graphics and things like that. So I think just having diversity in skills, diversity in expertise, and, from the beginning, I didn't think that my sociology background would be that valuable, but it was. And so it's not always just the we need someone who knows business, we need someone who is creative. Like things will emerge as a group comes together. And I think in any scenario, there's people who have different backgrounds, have different ways of approaching the same issue, and that's helpful, that's valuable. So we had that core group, but then we also had a large group of students who were maybe not willing to pull all-nighters and strategize of like what should our next move be, but they were willing to show up when we had an event and be another body at a protest or be another signature on a petition. So I think having several like levels of involvement, I guess, is important to a movement or a campaign, I guess.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I'd say in sum, a diverse set of skills and experiences and backgrounds, but then also a diverse level of involvement where there's people who are willing to, be there to actually put in a lot of time, things like that.
And how did you figure out like who is going to invest a lot of time, who is going to invest like as somebody active and able at a protest or active and able to sign a petition? And how did you differentiate between that so you could have like an effective kind of cellular approach to building up people and support?
Yeah, I think it was sort of unique in the way that we started, where we started with like a couple students who were in the same class. From there, it branched out, like, just social networks. We're at a university and a small one at that. So a lot of people know a lot of people. And so we started with just students that we knew had a lot of background knowledge on climate change, had that, in my case, I had that class that explicitly connected theology and climate change and, connected those dots between why we should act. And so it started just the group of students who already knew the science, already knew why we were compelled to act already. But from there, we engaged students who didn't particularly have a huge background in climate science, or didn't know, the particular parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and things like that, um, or who couldn't on their own before connect the dots between, Creighton's mission and the fossil fuel industry. So
Right.
in our case, it was sort of, who do we know already has this, and that's where we started. But that education piece was really important in expanding that sort of core group.
Yeah.
And then even further, the education piece was important, just talking to students, just like being on social media, just putting on events and having students stop by and say like, oh, what is this, like, what are you guys standing here for? And having those just like really basic, not in depth, but just like conversations of, oh yeah, so Creighton has an endowment. This endowment is invested in fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are bad. Climate change is happening. And, just on a very easy, basic, non-confrontational level, connecting those dots.
Yeah. All right, so let's talk about your leadership and kind of what you're hoping to do, because let's take a few moments to kind of just look at what you're hoping to accomplish, because you said you're a PhD student in sociology and communication, sociology and go ahead.
Community and environmental sociology, yeah.
Community and environmental sociology. So I think, tell us a little bit about what you want to accomplish with your degree and kind of what you're hoping for in terms of like the future of leadership around the climate change mitigation and reduction.
Yeah. So even in undergrad, I have found myself at this intersection of, sociology of religion, environmental sociology, looking at particularly the Catholic Church and how, the Catholic Church is a human institution, so how are we as humans, how are we as particularly Catholics addressing climate change? How are we not? How can we improve? Like, where are the roadblocks, things like that. And so I am involved right now in a project that we're very close to getting published, about the bishops and which bishops did or did not address climate change, particularly in their diocesan publications. And so my experience with that has sort of, it's strengthened my knowledge of the literature, about, organizational sociology, and looking at the Catholic Church as an organization, and like looking how decisions are made, how things get done, how patterns emerge. And so in the future, I hope to continue that. I think I've sort of found this like corner of scholarship that really interests me, and it's pretty personal to me. I'm a cradle Catholic who's involved in all this environmental organizing. So I think continuing to look at the Catholic Church as a key player in especially American climate action, but sort of going at the step further and looking at the institution, the church as a whole, and looking at when we have all this potential, when we have a mission that aligns with climate action, when we have a pope who has made very explicit the need for bold action and timely action, when we have this huge base of people, why have we not moved already? And where are those roadblocks? So I think I'll probably, in my research at least, continue to look at that, and my research is very much informed by my own experiences and my own activism experiences. So looking at like grassroots organization within American Catholics.
Okay, wonderful. And so kind of the last question that I have for you is thinking about, so you were picked to be a leader for the Laudato Si in the U.S. Catholic Church for the track leads in the youth and young adult segment. So can you tell us a little bit about how your your leadership role there and what you are hoping that this conference and the work of this young adult group will do in terms of engaging young adult Catholics in the issue of climate change.
Yeah, so like you said, I was a track lead of the youth and young adult mobilization track of this Laudato Si conference. And so we had a working group of 30 fantastic young adults who put in a lot of time and energy. And so as part of this conference, we have developed a resource for young adults that can be used in several contexts, whether that's a parish context, a school context, whatever. But it's this sort of curriculum or like process that young adults can go through to connect the dots that we've been talking about this whole time. So like, what about our Catholic faith requires climate action, and what does that look like? How do I do that? So as a leader in this track, it was really, really cool and encouraging to see, the involvement of other young adults, the enthusiasm of other young adults who like got this, who had already connected the dots for themselves, and were responding to that through involvement in this conference, in this track.
Yep.
And so I think that really affirmed for me that, it can work. Like we can do this, we can do something. So I think moving forward, I recognize the power that young people have, especially in the church. The Catholic Church has seen a huge decrease in young people. I mean, young people are leaving the church in response to some of the things that are happening on, the higher level of like the church hierarchy. But that's not to say that they're like forgetting Catholic values. There's young people who are hungry to do something with like who they feel they are based on the Catholic faith, and I think are just looking for ways to do that, for paths to go on. And so in that, the church is listening to young people because they want to keep people, but
yeah.
I think an opportunity like the one we had, where we had 30 young adults just like huddle together and get something done and talk about issues of like climate change, where like we had some sort of power in that. And even in presenting this resource that we're developing, people were listening, people were interested. They want to know what young people want, they want to know what young people think. And so I think, for me at least, it has really affirmed the need to continue to have conversations with young people, to uplift young people's voices in the church and get some stuff done.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's what the kind of vital part is in terms of next steps, is how do you build that base of young adults that are going to build leadership and maintain momentum even when things are challenging.
Yeah.
And so this was wonderful. I'm really impressed with the work you're doing at Creighton. I'm a huge fan. I'm privileged to also call you a friend, so that's also disclaimer. Like, Emily Burke is great. She's got a very bright future and a bright present. Like, getting a successful divestment campaign done is a lot of work, as she's highlighted here, and I think it gives us a lot to think about in terms of our own work that we're doing in all of our own respective dioceses or Catholic institutions, of just how do we really think creatively to get the work done that needs to be done and exercise responsible stewardship. Like, the burden of proof is on us to make the changes necessary so that we could put our best foot forward as Catholic people. And so thank you, Emily, for being live with us on the Center for Mission YouTube page this morning. We'll get this posted as soon as we can, hopefully in the next few days, and then that will go out to people on our Care for Creation distribution list, but we can also spread this to other networks. If you have any thoughts, you can email the Archdiocesan Care for Creation team at creation@archspm.org. So it's creation, CREATION, at archspm.org. Looking forward to our next conversation. Hopefully we'll have a few more one-on-one interviews with various people doing good social justice ministry, and then be ready for our November series with to commemorate the end of the year of Saint Joseph. Thank you for your time, and we will look forward to having you all live for our next conversation.